It's hard to imagine, but there was a time when Wallis Simpson was seen as the woman who nearly brought the British monarchy to its knees. Her scandalous romance with Edward VIII, the king who abdicated his throne to marry her, reshaped the course of history. But who was Wallis Simpson before she became one of the most infamous figures of the 20th century? To understand how this American divorcee changed the destiny of the British crown, we need to go back to the very beginning of her life, a life that was marked by privilege, scandal, and survival. Wallis Simpson, born Bessie Wallace Warfield in June 1896, came into the world under circumstances that set the tone for her tumultuous life. Her wealthy parents, part of Baltimore's elite, were staying at a luxurious Pennsylvania resort when Wallis was born. This glamorous start seemed to foreshadow the life of luxury and controversy she would later lead, but her birth wasn't without whispers of scandal. Her parents had only married 7 months before she was born, leading to speculation that Wallis may have been conceived out of wedlock. Desperate to avoid the stigma, Wallis often claimed that her parents had tied the knot earlier in June 1895. Still, the shadow of potential disgrace hung over her early years, and this wouldn't be the last secret she tried to bury. Wallis's life took a tragic turn almost immediately. When she was just 5 months old, her father contracted tuberculosis, a disease that would quickly claim his life. His death left Wallis and her mother Alice in a precarious position. Without the support of her husband, Alice was suddenly alone and vulnerable, with a young daughter to raise. Their once secure high society life was thrown into disarray, and Alice was forced to rely on the charity of her late husband's family to survive. For a time, Wallis and her mother were taken in by her father's wealthy relatives, who grudgingly provided financial support. But this charity came at a cost. Alice and Wallis were treated as little more than burdens, their every expense scrutinized and controlled. The family's disdain was palpable, but they allowed Alice and Wallis to live in their grand Baltimore home, at least for a while. The arrangement was far from stable, and their lives were marked by constant uncertainty. Things came to a head when rumors began to swirl about Alice's relationship with Sol Warfield, Wallis's wealthy uncle who controlled the family's purse strings. Gossip suggested that their bond had become romantic, a scandalous idea that outraged the rest of the family. Whether or not the rumors were true, the reaction was swift and brutal. The family cut off financial support and evicted Alice and Wallis from their home, leaving them to fend for themselves. Wallis Simpson's ascent from a precarious childhood to high society was anything but accidental. Even as her mother struggled to make ends meet after being cut off by Wallis's father's family, her wealthy uncle insisted that Wallis receive a top-tier education. She was sent to the most prestigious girls' school in the state, where her natural ambition began to shine. Classmates described Wallis as decisive, focused, and relentlessly determined. Once she set her sights on something, there was no stopping her. Her classmates also noticed another trait, her ability to attract admirers wherever she went. Wallis was already preparing for a life where charm and determination would get her everything she wanted, but Wallis knew the precariousness of her position in Baltimore society. After all the instability she had endured, security became her ultimate goal. To ensure a stable future, Wallis set her sights on finding the right husband, one who could elevate her status and provide the life of comfort and prestige she craved. Becoming a debutante and hosting a coming-out ball would have been the logical next steps, but the timing was far from ideal. With her family's financial struggles, Wallis had to think strategically, and as always, she found a way forward. Looking for a change of scenery, Wallis decided to visit her cousin Corinne in Pensacola, Florida. It was a welcome escape from the rigid norms of Baltimore's high society. Corinne's husband, a Navy pilot, introduced Wallis to the thrilling world of aviation, a field that was both cutting edge and glamorous at the time. For a while, Wallis reveled in the excitement, but her time in Pensacola took a traumatic turn. She witnessed not one, but two horrific aviation accidents, events so shocking they left her with a lifelong fear of flying. Ironically, it was in Pensacola that Wallis's life took a dramatic turn, setting her on the path to her first marriage. At a lunch organized by her cousin, Wallis met Earl Winfield Spencer Jr., a dashing young Navy pilot. Spencer was charming, handsome, and full of promise, embodying the adventurous spirit of aviation. Wallis was captivated. Despite not being the old money type she'd courted in November of 1916, they tied the knot in a glamorous wedding, followed by a honeymoon at a luxurious resort in West Virginia. But the honeymoon phase, quite literally, didn't last long. During their honeymoon, Wallis discovered a disturbing truth about her new husband. Spencer had a penchant for heavy drinking, something that hadn't been apparent during their courtship. The issue came to light when they arrived in West Virginia, a dry state. Upon realizing he couldn't easily access alcohol, Spencer wanted to cancel the entire trip. Only after remembering he had smuggled a bottle of gin in his luggage did he agree to stay. For Wallis, this was the first of many red flags. Wallis Simpson's marriage to Earl Winfield Spencer Jr. was doomed from the start, a toxic cocktail of deception, dysfunction, and destructive behavior. Despite her high society upbringing, Wallis was surprisingly naive when it came to understanding the depths of her husband's drinking problem. Early on, she began to notice curious habits at their dinner parties. Naval officers were prohibited from drinking alcohol within 24 hours of a flight, yet Spencer and his friends always seemed to enjoy consommé out of soup bowls. Wallis eventually realized the truth. Those bowls were filled with martinis, not soup. The drinking was bad enough, but it was only the beginning of a far darker reality. Spencer's alcoholism took their marriage to increasingly sinister places. His drinking wasn't limited to social settings. It spilled into every aspect of their lives, even his work. He would lock Wallis in their home when he left, sometimes leaving her trapped for hours. On one occasion, he locked her in the bathroom, further revealing his controlling and erratic behavior. But his most alarming act came when he decided to fly a plane while intoxicated. Spencer crashed his aircraft into the ocean, miraculously escaping serious injury. For Wallis, the incident was a terrifying glimpse into just how reckless her husband had become. At the same time, Spencer's frequent relocations as a naval officer helped mask the cracks in their marriage. During one assignment in California, Wallis crossed paths with a man who would later change her life, Prince Edward, the future King of England. However, their first encounter was entirely forgettable, at least for Edward, who had no memory of the meeting. From California, the Spencers moved to Washington, D.C., a city that brought Wallis a taste of the social life she had always dreamed of. For a brief moment, she felt fulfilled. But beneath the surface, the cracks in their relationship deepened, and it wasn't just Spencer's drinking that was to blame. When Spencer was stationed in Hong Kong, Wallis refused to join him, choosing instead to remain in Washington. While he was away, she began a passionate affair with an Argentine diplomat. Their romance was fiery but ultimately unfulfilling. Wallis hoped it might lead to a future together, but her lover had his sights set on marrying someone wealthy. All Wallis had was a modest Navy allowance, and her dream of a stable relationship slipped through her fingers. During this period, Wallis and Spencer's marriage became a toxic cycle of separation and reconciliation. They were stuck in a stalemate, each unable to break free entirely. Eventually, Wallis decided to join Spencer in Hong Kong, hoping to salvage what was left of their marriage. It proved to be a disastrous decision. Spencer's drinking had reached new lows, and their relationship crumbled for good. Wallis moved out, marking the beginning of the end for their union. Although they remained legally married for a time, Wallis didn't let her marital status stop her from embracing her freedom. Wallis Simpson's life in China was filled with glamour and intrigue, but it was also marked by a devastating chapter that would change her forever. As she traveled from party to party, staying in lavish homes and making powerful connections, she began a whirlwind romance with an Italian diplomat while in Beijing. The affair, like much of Wallis's life, was a mix of passion and risk, but soon it took a life-altering turn. Wallis discovered she was pregnant, a scandalous situation for an unmarried woman in her social circles. Desperate to avoid the fallout, she sought an abortion. What happened next would haunt Wallis for the rest of her life. Many of her biographers speculate that the procedure was botched, leaving her unable to have children. The physical and emotional toll of the experience was devastating. Wallis returned to the United States heartbroken, but one thing had become clear to her. She was ready to reclaim control of her life. And that started with ending her disastrous marriage to Earl Winfield Spencer, Jr. Back in the U.S., Wallis announced her decision to divorce Spencer, sending shockwaves through her family. Divorce was still a taboo topic at the time, especially for women, and her family was scandalized by her. It wasn't long before Wallis met the man who would help her turn her life around, Ernest Aldrich Simpson, a wealthy shipping executive. Their first meeting was electric, but there was one significant complication. Ernest was already married. His wife, furious at Wallis, would later claim that she had ruined her life and taken everything from her. But Wallis and Ernest were already looking ahead. Within weeks of Ernest's divorce, the two tied the knot, making Wallis the second Mrs. Simpson after just 7 months of singlehood. With Ernest's wealth and status, Wallis settled into London society, a world of aristocratic grandeur and rigid expectations. Determined to fit in, she leaned on her sister-in-law for a crash course on how to navigate the upper echelons of British society. Wallis quickly learned the importance of recognizing every royal, no matter how distant their relation to the king and queen. It was a lesson that would prove invaluable as her path brought her closer and closer to the most powerful family in the country. Wallis Simpson did not immediately enter the hearts of the British royal family, but rather by pre-calculation. Her introduction into Edward VIII's social circle came through her growing network of high society friends in London. At the time, Edward was the heir apparent to the throne, but he wasn't exactly behaving like a future king. Instead, Edward was enjoying his playboy lifestyle, indulging in a series of affairs. One of his most notable relationships was with the married Thelma, Lady Furness. And yet Thelma wasn't the only mistress vying for the prince's attention. For Edward, the thought of wearing the crown seemed far off, and he appeared more interested in sowing his wild oats than preparing for the responsibilities of monarchy. Wallis didn't immediately captivate the prince, but when they finally met, she made sure to leave an impression he wouldn't forget. Edward later recounted in his memoirs that Wallis playfully roasted him during their first encounter. The prince had a habit of greeting American women with the same tired line, "Do you miss central heating?" But Wallis wasn't about to let him get away with it. With her trademark wit, she cheekily responded that she'd hoped for something more original. That simple, sharp comment set her apart and ensured that Edward would remember her. Their meeting wasn't yet romantic, but it was the beginning of something that would eventually shake the British monarchy to its core. By 1931, Wallis's social climbing had brought her to one of the most prestigious events in British high society. Her presentation at court to King George V and Queen Mary. This was a rare honor for a divorced woman, and it positioned Wallis and her husband, Ernest Simpson, firmly within the upper echelons of British aristocracy. Intriguingly, Wallis wasn't the only divorced woman in Edward's orbit to receive such an honor. Thelma Furness, his mistress, had also been presented at court. Whether it was coincidence or calculation, Wallis and her husband were now regular fixtures in the prince's social scene. As Wallis and Edward's friendship deepened, their connection became undeniable. Thelma embarked on an extended trip abroad. Edward began to rely more heavily on Wallis for companionship. He frequently called her and even showed up at her home unannounced, much to the delight of Wallis, who was clearly making an impression. For a time, their growing bond seemed harmless, even welcomed. But that would soon change. When Thelma returned to England, it didn't take long for her to realize something was amiss. Edward, once attentive and affectionate, had grown distant. As she observed his interactions with Wallis, the truth became painfully clear. He was in love with her. Heartbroken, Thelma packed her bags and left, exiting Edward's life for good. With one rival out of the way, Wallis was now positioned as Edward's closest confidant. Wallis knew she needed to officially end her marriage to Ernest if she wanted to continue her love affair with Edward. Conveniently, Ernest appeared to make things easy for her. He was reportedly having an affair with Mary Raffray, one of Wallis's close friends. Given the Church of England's strict rules on divorce, allowing it only in cases of proven adultery, this was the perfect excuse. Ernest was conveniently caught booking a hotel room with Raffray, who incidentally was already in the midst of her own divorce. From the very beginning of his reign, Edward made every effort to integrate Wallis into his royal life. She attended events by his side, despite the fact that his family openly resented her, often referring to her dismissively as that woman. Yet Edward was undeterred. He pushed forward with plans to solidify their relationship and began speaking openly about marrying Wallis. Under the British Constitution, the king had the legal right to marry whomever he chose. But this wasn't a fairy tale. It was a high-stakes political reality. Marrying someone the Parliament didn't approve of could spark a constitutional crisis, the likes of which hadn't been seen since the 17th century. As a new monarch, Edward needed to tread carefully, but subtlety had never been his strong suit, and his passion for Wallis drove him to act boldly. Desperate for a solution, Edward explored every possible avenue to make Wallis his wife. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin proposed a compromise, a morganatic marriage. Under this arrangement, Edward and Wallis could wed, but Wallis would not receive a royal title or rank, and any children they had would not inherit the throne. Edward presented the idea to the prime ministers of Australia, Canada, and South Africa, hoping for their approval. But the answer was unanimous and resounding: no. Had Edward exercised patience and worked to shift public opinion over time, many historians believe he could have married Wallis without the explosive fallout that followed. But patience was not in Edward's nature. At 40, he acted with the impulsiveness of a much younger man, consumed by his obsession with making Wallis his queen. Instead of navigating the situation diplomatically, he pressed for hasty solutions, a strategy that was about to backfire in spectacular fashion. For years, the British press had adhered to an unspoken agreement to remain silent about Edward's relationship with Wallis. While American newspapers printed sensational headlines like "King will wed Wally," English journalists refrained from covering the scandal, maintaining a carefully curated image of the monarchy. Among the upper echelons of British society, Wallis's presence was no secret. Over time, they had begrudgingly grown accustomed to seeing her by Edward's side. But for the general public, Edward's relationship with Wallis remained a mystery. On a freezing December morning, the veil of secrecy was torn away. English newspapers hit the stands emblazoned with the headline, "Grave Constitutional Crisis." The pages were filled with stories about Wallis Simpson, the twice-divorced American woman who had captured the king's heart. For the middle and working classes, who were just learning about Edward's relationship, the revelations were shocking. Fury spread like wildfire. Protests erupted outside Wallis's home, with angry mobs decrying her as a threat to the monarchy. The situation became so volatile that Wallis received death threats, leaving her completely unprepared for the storm of public outrage. Despite the protection of royal guards, Wallis felt the pressure was too much to bear. Together with Lord Brownlow, a close friend of Edward VIII, she devised a daring escape plan to flee England and lay low in Cannes, France, with trusted friends. But there was one catch. Wallis's paralyzing fear of flying complicated the journey. Traveling by car stretched what could have been a quick getaway into a multi-day ordeal. Her farewell with Edward was passionate and tear-filled, and as they parted ways, neither knew it would be nearly 3 years before Wallis would step foot in England again. Wallis had hoped to disappear into obscurity in France, but disaster struck almost immediately upon her arrival. Edward, in his haste, had failed to arrange the proper passports and travel documents under the pseudonym they had agreed on. French customs officials quickly pieced together her identity, recognizing her from the explosive tabloid coverage of her romance with the king. Within hours, the media descended, and her so-called secret escape was blown wide open. What followed was a chaotic and poorly executed journey that spiraled further out of control. Reporters managed to track Wallis after an overnight stop, leading to a violent altercation between her British security guard and an aggressive photographer. To make matters worse, Wallis accidentally left the note containing the code names Edward had given them at a hotel bar, leaving their plans exposed. Reporters dogged their every move, and the party repeatedly got lost or delayed. What should have been a straightforward 12 to 14-hour drive turned into a grueling, chaotic 3-day odyssey. Edward, while deeply devoted to Wallis, proved himself far more adept at planning royal vacations than secret escapes. His efforts to shield Wallis only seemed to make things worse. By the time Wallis finally reached Cannes, she was physically and emotionally exhausted. Safely ensconced at her friend's home, she began to question everything. Lord Brownlow, speaking candidly with her, laid out the stakes. He told Wallis that there was only one way Edward VIII could remain on the throne. She would have to remove herself from the situation entirely. With the weight of the monarchy's future pressing on her, Wallis released a public statement from Cannes offering to withdraw from the relationship if it would end the crisis. Newspapers eagerly reported that the turmoil was over, but behind the scenes, nothing could have been further from the truth. Edward had already made up his mind. Even before Wallis's statement, the king had begun setting the wheels in motion for a decision that would alter the course of British history. Just days later, he issued his own public declaration, sending shockwaves throughout the nation. Edward announced his intention to abdicate the throne, relinquishing his crown in order to be with the woman he loved. His younger brother Albert would ascend as King George VI, a transition that stunned both the monarchy and the public. For Edward, the transition from king to ordinary man was far from smooth. Abdicating the throne left him not just without a crown, but also without a home or country to call his own. For months he drifted, relying on the generosity of wealthy friends like the Rothschilds, who housed him in Vienna. Meanwhile, Wallis remained in France, unable to join him until her divorce from Ernest Simpson was finalized. Any misstep could jeopardize the legal process, and the couple was forced to live separate lives. As Wallis busied herself planning their wedding and assembling a luxurious trousseau of over 50 outfits, Edward struggled to adjust to life outside the monarchy. For the first time in his life, he was confronted with bills, and he didn't like it. A man accustomed to the bottomless resources of the crown, Edward was shocked every time he had to pay for something. Though his family had granted him the title of Duke of Windsor, the title came with little financial support. His ongoing struggle to secure the funds he felt entitled to became a recurring issue that would haunt both him and Wallis for years to come. After months apart, the couple was finally reunited under the shadow of scandal. Following the court's finalization of Wallis's divorce, Edward joined her at a French chateau, a venue chosen with the assistance of his brother, King George VI. It was an unfamiliar location owned by a stranger, but it provided the privacy they needed. Having been apart for nearly 5 months since Wallis's escape from England, the two wasted no time setting a date for their wedding. Just weeks after reuniting, they planned to tie the knot on June 3, 1937. The haste was unsurprising. They had sacrificed so much to be together. None of Edward's family attended the ceremony, a pointed snub from the royal establishment that highlighted the enduring tensions surrounding their union. Still, the event went off without a hitch, and Wallis stunned onlookers with her choice of attire, a slim, tailored dress in a striking shade of soft blue designed by Mainbocher. The press couldn't get enough of her look, and the public was captivated by the image of Wallis as a sophisticated, stylish bride. Wallis Simpson may have become part of the royal family after marrying Edward VIII, but her welcome was anything but warm. King George VI granted her the title of Duchess of Windsor, but refused to bestow upon her the honor of being called Her Royal Highness. To Edward, this wasn't just a matter of protocol, it was a devastating blow, a symbolic reminder of everything he believed his family had taken from him. Furious and deeply bitter, Edward never got over what he saw as a deliberate snub. The royal family's coldness didn't stop there. Edward and Wallis were not welcomed at Buckingham Palace, and Wallis herself was essentially blacklisted. While Edward was occasionally granted informal visits, Wallis was treated as persona non grata, a constant reminder of how deeply the monarchy disapproved of their union. Wallis, however, wasn't one to let the snub go quietly. In a subtle yet defiant act of self-assertion, she instructed her servants to address her as Her Royal Highness at home. Subtle? Not exactly. But Wallis was determined to claim some semblance of respect, even if it was behind closed doors. Shut out from London's elite social circles, Edward and Wallis turned to a new crowd for companionship, and their choice of friends was disastrous. Their host at the chateau, where they wed, Charles Bedeau, was an avowed fascist with a growing interest in Adolf Hitler's Germany. Things only got worse on their honeymoon. The couple boarded a train at the Italian border, only to discover it belonged to none other than Benito Mussolini. Red flags, both literal and figurative, seemed to follow them everywhere. But it didn't stop there. While Wallis and Edward likely viewed their honeymoon as a romantic escape, to the rest of the world, it was a PR nightmare. Edward, already under intense scrutiny, was caught on camera performing a fascist salute during their time in Italy. Meanwhile, their old friend Bedeau organized an official visit for the couple to the United States, footing the bill himself. Wallis was thrilled at the prospect of returning to her homeland, but the trip was a complete disaster. Bedeau's shady reputation sparked outrage, and American protests erupted over the visit. Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of the United States, refused to host them, and a British ambassador intervened, strongly urging them to cancel the trip. By this point, Wallis and Edward's post-abdication life was unraveling, leaving them adrift in a world that seemed increasingly hostile. Edward's fascination with Germany was no secret. He had long admired its air force and leadership and was disturbingly comfortable offering a casual Heil salute. The all-expenses-paid trip seemed to align with his interests, and as his devoted wife Wallis went along. During their meeting, Edward held a lively conversation with Hitler in German, while Wallis participated in the salutes, later claiming she didn't understand the discussion. The British royal family, already alienated from Edward and Wallis, was horrified by their actions. Rumors began swirling that Wallis might be more than just a controversial outsider. Some speculated she was a German agent. Whispers suggested she had been planted in the U.S. years earlier with the express purpose of destabilizing the monarchy. While these claims were unfounded, they added another layer of mistrust and disdain to the already strained relationship between the couple and the royal family. As World War II escalated and German forces advanced on Paris, Wallis and Edward fled their French home, eventually landing in Portugal. It was here that Edward's brother, King George VI, finally gave him an appointment, governor of the Bahamas. Though far from the prestige of the English throne, the role gave the couple a semblance of purpose. Wallis assumed the responsibilities of a governor's wife, taking on charity work with the Red Cross. However, her behavior in the Bahamas quickly overshadowed any goodwill. Her comments about the local population were appallingly racist, and her frequent trips to the U.S. for shopping sprees during Britain's wartime rationing only worsened her image. Wallis was no stranger to being cast as the villain, but in this instance she leaned into it with alarming ease. When the war ended, Wallis and Edward left the Bahamas and resumed their life of leisure, drifting between luxurious vacations and social gatherings with the Café Society set. This elite circle of wealthy socialites welcomed the exiled couple, allowing them to bask in the glamour of high society without the constraints of royal duties. Yet their aimlessness persisted, and their knack for making tone-deaf remarks didn't help. After a cat burglar made off with millions worth of Wallis's jewels, the couple's clueless comments about the loss further alienated the public. But the heist took an even darker turn when a friend recognized one of the stolen pieces in a jeweler's shop. This sparked speculation that the royal family might have orchestrated the theft to reclaim what they believed rightfully belonged to them, including jewels that Edward had once gifted to Wallis. By the 1950s, Wallis and Edward had effectively retired into a quiet life of luxury in Paris. The French government provided them with a stately villa in the Bois de Boulogne, but while France welcomed them, England remained frosty. The royal family's disdain for Wallis meant that the couple missed key events, including Queen Elizabeth II's wedding and George VI's declining health. When George VI passed away, Edward attended the funeral alone. Wallis was notably absent, as she was again when Queen Mary died a year later. In fact, Wallis wasn't invited to a royal funeral until 1967, 14 years later. With Edward working on his memoirs, Wallis traveled alone to New York City. While there, she struck up a close friendship with Jimmy Donahue, a young socialite 25 years her junior. The pair attended countless parties together, sparking rumors of an affair. The whispers grew so loud that Edward rushed to New York to see for himself what was going on. When Edward arrived, Wallis greeted him at the dock with a passionate kiss, much to the delight of waiting photographers. It was a picture-perfect moment that temporarily silenced the gossip. At some point, Wallis must have revealed the truth to Edward. Jimmy Donahue was gay, and their relationship was purely platonic. But the rumors didn't stop there. Edward's time in New York, where he joined Wallis and Jimmy on their party circuit, gave rise to even wilder speculation, this time claiming that all three of them were involved in an affair together. By the late 1950s, the years of indulgence and scandal began catching up to them. Edward's health deteriorated, while Wallis's obsession with maintaining her youthful looks led her to frequent plastic surgeries. Edward started losing his memory and hearing, but Wallis remained as charming and vivacious at social events as ever. Invitations to royal family gatherings slowly began to trickle in, but Edward was often too unwell to attend. In 1972, a significant moment seemed to signal a thaw in their strained relationship with the royal family. Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, during a state visit to France, planned to visit Wallis and Edward. The timing, however, was bittersweet. Edward had recently undergone surgery, and it was clear to everyone that his time was running out. The visit went smoothly, but just 10 days later, Edward passed away at the age of 77. Wallis, now a widow, faced life alone for the first time in decades. After Edward's death, the royal family finally offered Wallis a modicum of kindness. Queen Elizabeth sent a message of sympathy and arranged for Edward's body to be flown to England for a royal funeral. Wallis was even invited to stay at Buckingham Palace during the proceedings, a gesture she had never experienced during Edward's lifetime. But the loss of her husband left Wallis utterly devastated. At the funeral, her erratic behavior raised concerns, with some speculating she had been tranquilized beforehand. When the Prime Minister approached to offer his condolences, Wallis reportedly thanked him and, still disoriented, invited him to visit the Duke and me in Paris. The royal family's hospitality was short-lived. While they had allowed Wallis to stay at Buckingham Palace, the entire family left for Windsor immediately after her arrival, leaving her alone in the palace over the weekend. Following the funeral, a senior staff member escorted her to the airport and put her on a plane back to Paris. For a woman who had a lifelong fear of flying, the gesture felt cold and deliberate. Any goodwill extended to Wallis seemed to vanish the moment Edward was buried. After Edward's death, Wallis's world began to crumble. The financial security she once enjoyed now seemed precarious. She sold properties and personal belongings, consumed by anxiety over money. But her declining mental health hinted at a deeper issue. Friends noticed she began forgetting names and losing track of conversations. Her confusion and erratic behavior worsened, and Wallis was eventually diagnosed with dementia, a condition that would consume her final years. Even as her mind faltered, Wallis's resentment toward the royal family remained intact. According to her staff, she often picked up newspapers featuring Queen Elizabeth or the Queen Mother and unleashed scathing remarks about them. However, she reportedly maintained a soft spot for Prince Charles, a curious footnote in her turbulent relationship with the monarchy. By 1978, Wallis Simpson's life had unraveled completely. Once a figure of glamour and controversy, she was now bedridden, unable to participate in the social life she had once dominated. Her lawyer, Suzanne Blum, held power of attorney, but Blum's control over Wallis's affairs raised concerns. Known for her litigious nature, Blum had spent years aggressively suing anyone who mentioned the Duke and Duchess in an unflattering light. In her final years, Wallis was confined to her bed, unable to speak for the last 6 of them. During this time, her lawyer, Suzanne Blum, controlled her affairs but exploited the situation in deeply unsettling ways. Blum falsely claimed to the press that Wallis and Edward had sold off their valuables long before she began working for them. This lie served as a cover for Blum to quietly sell Wallis's possessions, including priceless jewelry, to her own friends at prices far below market value. By the time this mismanagement came to light, many of Wallis's treasures were gone forever. After 8 years of bedridden isolation, Wallis Simpson passed away in 1986 at the age of 89, leaving behind a life that had reshaped history. Wallis Simpson and the Duke of Windsor's story is one of love and defiance, forever etched into the annals of history. While their romance came at an extraordinary cost, it remains a testament to the power of following one's heart. From the glitz of royal courts to the quiet of their Parisian home, their journey was anything but ordinary. Thank you for joining us in uncovering the fascinating life of Wallis Simpson. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more incredible stories from the past. Until next time.